Hey, class, I hope you're doing well. In this, I should say it like I mean it. I really do hope you're doing well. Um, so, in this, I guess I'm so eager to get to my remarks. I can't even pretend to care about you, but I do care about you. Anyway, so in this podcast, I want to talk about chapter 6 of Gwyn. You're reading 6 and 7, chapter 6 and 7 of Gwyn for next week. It's a pretty light week. And the purpose of these chapters, is to talk about Texas history, the Republic of Texas, and its relationship with native groups, especially the Cherokee and the Comanche. Gwyn doesn't spend too much time on the Cherokee, he spends a lot more time on the Comanche. But here's the story, and here's what I want you to look for in chapter 6. So after the Texas Revolution, Sam Houston becomes the president of Texas. He can't succeed himself because of Texas laws. So the next president of Texas is a man by the name of Mehboob B. Lamar. And if you're from Houston, you might know about Lamar High School. I know there's a Lamar Middle School on Burnett Road in Austin. And what we're starting to see is Anglo names starting to appear in Texas as Anglos now are taking over Texas. And Lamar was a very different kind of figure than Houston. Houston very much wanted Texas to be part of the United States. And Houston's vision of Texas is the one that ultimately succeeds, although it's going to take a decade to get there. Texas doesn't become part of the United States until 1845. But Lamar, who is the second president of Texas, he has a different vision of Texas. He wants Texas to stand on its own 2 feet. He thinks Texas can be an empire that stretches into what's now New Mexico, all the way to the Pacific, to California. So we see this strain in Texas today. Folks, there's a strand, I guess you would say, of Texas politics. You see these bumper stickers that say secede, that Texas can be an independent nation like it was between 1836 and 1845, that it can stand on its own. And those folks that think that that's ridiculous, that Texas is only powerful if it's part of the United States. I'm not going to weigh in on either side. I'm just pointing out that we've got these two strands of these two visions of Texas that started in 1836 after the revolution against Mexico, and we still see to this very day. So Lamar is very much Texas can be its own nation, can be its own empire. Now, when it came to indigenous groups, when it came to native peoples, Lamar has a very different policy than Houston. Houston especially was close to the Cherokee who have moved into Northeast Texas in the 1820s. They were forced out of the United States, and they were actually seeking shelter in Mexican Texas. First of all, Spanish, but then Mexican Texas in the 1820s. The Cherokee remained neutral in the revolution, the Texas Revolution against Mexico. Houston, actually, who had lived among the Cherokee, he had been governor of Tennessee, and then under mysterious circumstances, he had suddenly resigned and he went to live among the Cherokee in Tennessee. Apparently he was drunk or something for a year or so, but he was very close to the Cherokee. When he came into Texas, he negotiated with the Cherokee that were in Texas, and they remained neutral during the Texas Revolution, which was pretty critical because there weren't that many Cherokee in Northeast Texas. And don't confuse Cherokee with Comanche. They're two very, very different tribes. The Cherokee were much more sedentary. They were farmers. Actually, Cherokee in some parts of the U.S. owned slaves, which is kind of incredible to think about. Anyway, so they're very, very different from the Comanche. So Houston negotiates with them. There are promises that are made to the Cherokee if you remain neutral in the Texas Revolution, you'll get land. You'll get land in Northeast Texas around Nacogdoches, and Houston was the point man for this. and he's determined to keep peace with the Cherokee. Well, not much happens during his time as presidency with the Cherokee, but when Lamar comes into office, he decides he wants the Cherokee out of Texas, that the land that they have been promised is great cotton land, that only Anglos should own this land. He despised the Cherokee. He feared the Cherokee, although they were not warlike like the Comanche. There's no comparison whatsoever between the Cherokee and the Comanche. But Lamar decides that they have to go. And so he gins up this conspiracy during his presidency that the Cherokee are in league with Mexico as kind of a fifth column. The Cherokee are going to work with Mexican spies to overthrow the Texas Republic. And really what it is just a basic land grab. Lamar wants the land that the Cherokee own in Northeast Texas. And 1838, 1839, the Cherokee are defeated. They're defeated in battle. Gwynne talks about this briefly in the book. And ultimately, they're expelled from Texas into Oklahoma territory. And this is really the story of Texas Indians. It's a story of what today we would call ethnic cleansing, that Indian groups in Texas, indigenous groups in Texas, once they were defeated, they were kicked out of the borders of Texas. So it starts with the Cherokee. Then Lamar, he turns towards the much more powerful Comanche. And there's a significant portion of the Gwynne book on what's called the Council House fight. The Council House fight happened in 1840, in March of 1840. Basically, you have a massacre of Comanche chiefs by Texans meeting in San Antonio, and they met near San Fernando Cathedral. So be sure to read closely about the Council House fight and the subsequent events after the Council House fight, when Comanches killed a number of captives they had brought with them to San Antonio. I'm not really going to repeat what Gwynne talks about here. You can read about it. But the Council House fight is extremely important because what has happened is, and this is something that Gwynne talks about, we have a shift in the Comanche experience in Texas. They had not really had a hard time with the Spanish. They had not had a hard time with the Mexicans. The Mexican army was especially weak. But the Anglos are very, very different. The Anglos are willing to fight. They're much more stubborn. They're much more militant. They're actually much more powerful than the Spanish and the Mexicans. And ultimately, Anglo-Americans are going to defeat the Comanche. So from the point of view of the Comanche, the Texas Revolution is a very negative event, because now Anglos, who are a much tougher enemy than had been the Mexicans, rule Texas. And Anglos are much more willing to fight the Comanche. And ultimately, Anglos are going to win, although it's going to take until the 1870s and 1880s. So what we're looking at in the Council House fight is really the beginning of almost a 50-year war between Anglos and Comanches. The Comanches absolutely hated the Texans after the Council House fight. If you were on the plains, if you were in New Mexico or Texas or wherever, or you were outside of Texas and you were captured by the Comanche, remember the Comanches controlled a large area, eastern New Mexico, Oklahoma, parts of Kansas. If you were captured by the Comanche, you would never tell the Comanche that you were a Texan, because that would mean instant death, and not just instant death. You'd probably be tortured to death. And I'm not kidding when I say that. One of the things you'll read in Gwynne is the Comanches were very, very, very adept at killing people via torture. And I'm not being anti-Comanche here. This is just what the records show. So what you're seeing in chapter 6 is Mirabou B. Lamar, his suppression of the of, first of all, the Cherokee in Northeast Texas, and then really the beginning of the long war between the Comanche and Anglos that begins with the Council House fight in March of 1840. And I want you to know the details of that. I want you to know about Lockhart, the young captive who comes into San Antonio. I want you to know the consequences for the other Anglo captives that the Comanche had. And this is the last thing I'll say. The Comanche were very much part of a captive economy that had begun during the Spanish period. They would go in and they would kidnap children, and then they would ransom them back to their village or to their parents. And this was one of the ways that the Comanche made money. Well, the Anglos, the Spanish and the Mexicans were often willing to ransom back their children. With the Anglos, it was a very different story. So one of the things that I also want to introduce in chapter 6 here is that during this period, you have hundreds of children, Anglo children, and also still Tejanos being kidnapped by the Comanche. And this is one of the real stories of Texas history during this period. So I want you to be aware of what happens to the captives that come in with the Comanche into San Antonio to parley with the Texans in San Antonio after the massacre of the 32 chiefs. It's not a pretty story.